So, we are in chapter 2 of Ruth. We're going to start in verse 15. So let's first take 15 through 18 and break it down and see what it says. So starting in 15. Okay. There you go. There's Dave. All right. So starting in verse 15, it says, when she arose to glean, Boaz commanded his servants, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. And also you shall purposely pull out for her some grain from the bundles, and leave it that she may glean it, and do not rebuke her. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and was about an ephah of barley. So let's start with those verses first. So verse 15 begins with the reiteration of the privileged status and safety protections that Boaz commanded that Ruth should have while gleaning in his fields. The word insult there that's used is the word kalam in the Hebrew, and it means to humiliate or disgrace someone. So in other words, Boaz stated that no one was to, in essence, reduce Ruth to a lesser status. No one was, he wanted her seen in the eyes of the people and the workers in town to be seen the type of person that she is with the character that she had. So he intends to protect her physically from any harm, being in the company of the workers, and also emotionally. He does not want her to end up further being wounded as she was back in Moab in the tragedies of what occurred there and the loss of her husband, her brother-in-law, and also her father-in-law. So we see the effort that he's going to in terms of the treatment of Ruth. And I think one of the things that we should ask ourselves, and particularly as males, as husbands, is how are we doing? In other words, do we compliment enough? Do we encourage enough? Do we make efforts to build up our wife? Do we even, quote unquote, brag about our wife to other people? You know, talking about her abilities, her character, and all these things. Now, it's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. All right. This is not marriage counseling. All right. So why don't you turn to a very famous passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I want to show you what I think is a very interesting word. Just went past it. So 1 Corinthians 13. And we're going to look at verse 7. Here's this phrase that Paul makes about the nature of love. He says, it bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. The word there that we want to look at is the word for bears, okay? And what we see is it's the word stego in the Greek. And it means literally, and I think it's an interesting word, it means literally to cover with a roof. All right? Well, how does that make sense? Well, it further means to be silent about one should not talk about. In other words, being confidential. So in other words, love doesn't broadcast bad news about other people. Love tries to protect the reputation of others. Love does not point out every single fault. And it's easy for us to fall into that. From 1 Corinthians 13, why don't you turn it over to 1 Peter 4, and let's look at a verse there. First Peter 4, and I want to look at verse 8. Verse 8 says, above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. There's the word, covers, stego. Okay? So it gives you a little bit more, I think, in-depth concept of what he means when he says bears all things. There's a picture here about how it is that the lover treats the loved one. So I think that's something that we also should pay attention about. Now, back to Ruth chapter 2, we see that Boaz orders the workers to, quote, purposely pull out. I don't know how it goes in whatever translations you have, but mine says purposely pull out some of the sheaves. Okay, do you see it there? Now, this is the word, the word there is the word shalal. And shalal means to take some of the spoils, literally, as in, conquest of a town, taking the spoils, etc. So he's telling his workers to make certain to take some of the spoils of the field, as is, and he's telling them to leave it for Ruth to glean. So notice that Boaz secretly tells the workers. He doesn't broadcast his kindness to the whole community. He doesn't want her to feel that she is, in a sense, even though in a way she is, but a charity case. In other words, he wants her to have some dignity about what she's doing. And he wants to bless her and increase what she can get. Now, Ruth works, it says, from the early morning, that is the word Erev. It means literally that time before the sun actually arises, until evening. It reminds us, I think, of another section in Proverbs 31, verse 27, where it talks about the excellent wife. Let me turn there, or we can turn there, to Proverbs 31. All right. Proverbs 31. Okay. We want to look there at verse 27. It says, she opens her mouth in wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. And then 27, she looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. And certainly this is Ruth. She's certainly not eating the bread of idleness, though she is being given a gracious amount purposely. Notice that she still has to do something about it. She's working from before sunrise to essentially close to sunset. So God, notice here, God blesses Boaz by, and is generous to him in terms of the fields that he has and the wealth he has. But Ruth, at the same time, is to do the work in his field. She's to be diligent. Turn back and let's look at a verse in Romans 12. Romans chapter 12. And I want to look at verse 11. says, this is a commandment about our diligence. It says, not lagging behind in diligence, but fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. This is what Ruth is doing. She's fervent in spirit. She's diligent. She's not sitting down and expecting someone to do this for her. She's involved in the process. Now, to glean, the word literally means, and it's interesting, to pay attention to and to gather small pieces. To pay attention to the details and gather small pieces. In other words, it's something you have to work at. It's something you have to keep your eyes open. You have to remain focused in the process of gleaning. And importantly, you need to stoop lowly, stoop down to collect the grain that's there so that you can receive. So it's stooping down so that you can receive. Interestingly, Ruth is motivated by her need, but she's rewarded by her diligence. I'll say it again. She's motivated by her need, but she's rewarded by her diligence. And I think that's a good way to think about that. This should also be our attitude in doing the work that we do in God's kingdom. Now, it says in that verse that later she beat and winnowed out what she had accumulated. In other words, she has to do some additional work beyond harvesting. That is, she has to beat the stalks, the long stalks that the grain is on. She has to remove the kernels of the barley. And of course, then she also has to winnow it, throw it in the air and keep winnowing it so that the coating comes off the grain. All that is additional work that she needs to do. Now it says that when it's all done, that she collects in a basket an ephah. Now ephah, to give you an idea of approximately what it is, it would be close to 2/3 of a bushel basket in today's measure. It is considered to be, quote, 10 omers of a grain. Why is that true? Well, turn back to Exodus 16. And I'll show you where the definition is. Exodus chapter 16. Verse 16. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it every man as much as he could eat. You shall take an omer apiece according to the number of persons each of you has in your tent. So, an omer a day per person, and he's talking about manna here, okay, is what in Exodus 16 God commanded they should take. And of course, they needed to depend on it daily because it occurred daily. Interestingly, in the case of manna, except for the Shabbat, you couldn't accumulate it and save it because it would turn putrid in the process. You had to depend on it being provided each day. So we know that an approximate size and an approximate amount in which a person is supposed to eat in a day. Now, we see here that Boaz left in the field for Ruth a lot more than Ruth and Naomi needed for a day's meals, okay? It was a great abundance that he caused for her. I think I'm reminded of a verse. You don't have to turn if you don't want to, but it's in the book of James. And I'll turn to read it to you. It's James chapter 4. And we want to look at, I'll read you verse 6. It says, but he, that is the Lord, gives a greater grace. Isn't that an interesting phrase? A greater grace. Therefore, it says, quote, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. What is the image that we have of Ruth? She's humble. extremely, in every way. And therefore, she is guaranteed by God an abundance for her needs because she is indeed humble in this way. Now, right there, obviously, on the site at the end of the day, she threshes and winnows her grain and, of course, accumulates it in this basket, which she then takes home. We know that it's about 2/3 of a bushel basket. Notice that she never presumed that someone would assist her, nor did she ever complain in any way about the work that she was doing. All these things tell us about her character, and it's important because it's very typological ultimately. Now, Ruth, of course, provided grain for her, quote, family, that is, for she and Naomi. And, of course, we're encouraged to do this. You don't have to turn here, but in 1 Timothy 5:4, it says this very thing, that we're supposed to be diligent in providing. And yet, I'll have to say, sometimes I look around at our community, at people in the places that you see, the places that we go and frequent, and we listen to stories sometimes, and sadly, I don't think I see, for instance, grown children doing a lot of that for their older parents at all. And it's really sad that there isn't more of a gracious and thankful attitude in them, that they would want to do that they'd be driven to do so. But I don't see it happening a lot, unfortunately. Now, it says that Ruth and Naomi ate and, quote, had plenty to eat. This is a word in the Hebrew, plenty to eat. It's the word soba, and it means fullness or no more appetite. Why don't you turn to Psalm chapter 16, and let's look at a verse. Psalm 16. I want to show you another passage where the word soba is. Verse 11. Thou wilt make known to me the path of life. In thy presence is soba, fullness of joy. In thy right hand there are pleasures forever. So God is the God of, if you want to call it soba, of plenty. He offers much to those that he loves. Now, I think we see an important cycle here that's occurring, and we should recognize the cycle and apply it to our own lives. And the cycle goes like this. I call it the cycle of giving and receiving. The Lord is generous to Boaz and provides for him the ability to have many fields. And obviously, because of that, he becomes a wealthy man. Now, Boaz becomes generous to Ruth in both him offering her work and also giving her extra in the fields. He also not only offers her work, but of course he gives her this extra grain. He offers her protection. He offers her water, and he offers her hard to say in a row, okay, all these things, and yet she still is doing hard work. She's not sitting there and saying, feed me, provide for me. She's a part of the dynamic. She's a part of the process. Now, I think we need to ask ourselves, as we look at this cycle of generosity, we need to search our own hearts and say, how generous are we? How do we go above and beyond? What do we do that's a grace for other people? What do we do when we see a need? Are we motivated to go an extra mile to meet that need? Well, we should be. Both Boaz and Ruth are beautiful examples of this, and something that should penetrate us also. There's a parable about this very issue that I want us to read, because Jesus really nails this whole attitude down. turn to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18. Matthew 18, and we're going to start in verse 21. Okay? Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Up to even 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but rather 70 times 7, which really is an allusion for forever. There is no end. Okay? Verse 23. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a certain king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. And when he had begun to settle them, there was brought to him one who owed him 10,000 talents. Now, we don't know if that's silver, gold, or what, but even if it were silver, it's a lot of money. 10,000 talents. Verse 25. But since he did not have the means to repay, his Lord commanded him to be sold along with his wife and his children and all that he had for repayment of this debt. Well, that's a business deal, isn't it? You owe it, and I put a lien or confiscate these things because you owe this. Verse 26. The slave, therefore, falling down, prostrated himself before his master, okay, saying, have patience with me, and I'll repay you everything. Verse 27, and the Lord of that slave felt compassion, and released him and forgave him all his debt. Now there is grace at work. Verse 28, but that slave went out and found one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, which would be maybe 100 days' work, as opposed to possibly 10,000 talents of silver. In other words, a relatively small amount of money compared to the amount of money that he was forgiven. And he seized hold of him and began to choke him, saying, pay back what you owe me. So his fellow slave fell down and began to entreat him, saying, have patience with me and I'll repay you. You heard that before? Have patience with me and I'll repay you. He was unwilling, however, but went and threw him in a prison until he should pay back what was owed. Verse 31. So when his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were deeply grieved and came and reported to their own Lord all that had happened. Then summoning him, his Lord said, you wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt just because you entreated me. Just because you asked for grace. That's all. And then he says, should you not also have had mercy on your fellow slave, even as I also had mercy on you? And his Lord, moved with anger, handed him over to the torturers until he should repay all that was owed him. So shall my heavenly Father also do to you, if each of you does not forgive a brother from his heart. Okay? It's a beautiful parable that says, if you've experienced grace, then it should motivate you to want to show it. Not just to consume it, but to pass it on, to show it to other people. That shows that you understand that grace that was shown you, because it's supposed to motivate you into action. Now, back to Ruth, and let's read the next set of verses to the end of the chapter. So it's Ruth, chapter 2, and we're going to read 19 through 23. It says, her mother-in-law then said to her, where did you glean today, and where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the name of that man with whom I work today is Boaz. Verse 20, and Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and the dead. Again, Naomi said to her, the man is our relative. He's one of our closest relatives. Then Ruth the Moabitess said, "Furthermore, he said to me, you should stay close to my servants until the harvest is finished, until they finished all of my harvest." And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you should go out with his maids, lest others fall upon you in another field." So she stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So let's take this apart and see what's here. So Naomi begins to ask, where did you glean? I don't think she was really asking, where were you? I think rather she was asking, more likely, how did you bring home so much gleaning? Where were you that you got this? I mean, she knew. She was a Jewess. She'd lived, obviously, for years and years, most of her life in Israel. She'd lived in Bethlehem. You know, she's used to what gleaning. She knows what it looks like, obviously. And yet, she's looking at this amount that Ruth was able to accumulate and says, this is an unbelievable amount for gleaning. Where'd you get it? How did that happen? And of course, she wonders who, quote, took notice of Ruth. Took notice. That's in Hebrew the word nakar, and it means to consider carefully, or to investigate, or to inspect. In other words, this is the type of attention that Boaz was showing to Ruth. So Naomi, in essence, asks, who took such notice to bless you this way? That's really what she's saying there. So, of course, Ruth says to her, as a text, as we read, the person in the field is that of Boaz. Now, it's interesting that Naomi, the woman who, if you remember, renamed herself Mara, okay, bitterness, upon seeing this kind of graciousness, okay, responds by offering a blessing to Boaz himself. It's interesting that both Ruth and Boaz are used by the Lord to turn Naomi's bitterness to blessing. All right? And of course, in the process, they helped turn her unbelief to faith. They help turn her despair into hope and her emptiness into fullness. All of these things are accomplished by this kind of love that's being shown her. Now, I want to say that the liberation from cares or worries, as we read the scriptures and understand them, seems to occur when we finally cast our burdens upon the Lord, who promises that he will use all things for our good. Of course, it's often hard at a point in time to see what that good is. And we're not shown that good until the time comes that we can see the good. So it's a faith-operated system. I want you to turn to Psalm 55. Psalm chapter 55, or Psalm number 55. And I want to look at verse 22. It's a beautiful verse. Cast your burden upon the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never allow the righteous to be forsaken. And then I'm going to read 23 also, because I think the two are bound together. But thou, O God, will bring them down to the pit of destruction. Men of bloodshed and deceit will not live out half their days, but I'll trust in thee. Isn't it something that we struggle with when we see people that either lie to us, mislead us, or in some way mistreat us? And it happens regularly. And of course, it tends to make us angry. and it instinctively tends to want to make us get revenge. But God says in these verses, who's going to give the final revenge? He is. He's going to work it out, and he says that he will make certain that at some point in time that the sword of one who is wicked towards you will be turned against him. But we need to wait and trust and see how that occurs. It is hard to do. So Naomi begins to see that the Lord has not forsaken her. And of course, she makes a statement that I think is interesting. She says that from both the living and the dead. Now, because she now sees God's kindness, both to she and Ruth, that would be the kindness to the living. And also, I think, she also sees how God, despite the suffering she had, ministers also through the dead. That is, the loss of Elimelech and Ruth's husband, Chilion. It also, I believe, might imply, too, that she considers herself, quote, because of her grief, she considers herself the living dead. In other words, she's alive, but there's this principle of death that seems to be all over her, that she's almost imbued with this and she can't get out of it. But she's beginning to see that there's a little light at the end of the tunnel here. Now, so God, we see, blesses this. And also, she also finally realizes or remembers something that apparently she had somehow forgotten in all her grief. And that is that her husband, Elimelech, has a relative named Boaz. Notice in the story, there's nothing that tells us that she ever went to Boaz, initiated anything towards Boaz, tried to get a loan from Boaz, tried to get money from Boaz, appealed to Boaz. She didn't do any of those things. All right? She waited until God acted, and then she began to see through what God did that maybe there was going to be a solution here through her relative, Boaz. Now, interestingly also, it says that Boaz is as one who's closely related. And it's interesting, this is the first time that we use the Hebrew word that we're going to be seeing a lot as we go through the next couple of chapters. The word there is goel. And the word goel means a kinsman redeemer. That is someone who is a close relative who's able to take action in different ways to help or to resolve or to minister to someone in their family line. So now it's established that Boaz is the goel in this family and possibly towards Ruth herself. Now, the word relative also, I think, is an interesting word in the Hebrew. It's the word karab, and it means several things. It means to be near, or it means to be close by, or it means nearness in time, or it also can mean something near is at hand. So I think by the use of the word that Naomi is beginning to see the hand of God working, and she realized that God has something that he's doing.
Because when she came to Israel, she was kind of in the whatever.
Yeah,
thing,
right.
Right? And then Ruth started to act.
Right. Yes. Naomi is, we don't know exactly, but she's obviously not going out and doing probably very much. It could be that she is completely depressed by her despair. But Ruth acts despite that. Now, it's interesting that this word, karab, is used in some other very interesting verses. It's used in many verses to describe the coming of the day of the Lord. Same word. I'm not going to go to all these verses, but I'll note them for you, and you can look them up if you want to see them, where this word is used. You'll see it in Joel chapter 2, verse 1. You'll see it in Joel chapter 3, verse 14. You'll see it in the prophet Obadiah, chapter 1, verse 15. You'll see it in Zephaniah, chapter 1, verse 7, and also chapter 1, verse 14. So it appears that Naomi realizes that God's on the move, that something imminent is about to occur. Now, I wish I could show you a chart, but we're limited by what we can show at this point. But I'm going to go over it, and at a future time, I can try to print it off for you if you'd like a copy of it. It talks about the principle of the kinsman redeemer. And there's two sides of it. The left column is about the qualifications that need to be met to be a kinsman redeemer. The right side is the fulfillment of those in Messiah. Okay? So there's two columns. Now, in the first one, we realize that Boaz is a blood relative. That is, he is genetically related to the family in a fairly close way, and so indeed he qualifies that he's a blood relative. Now, how does that occur in terms of Messiah? Well, there's some verses that you can look up, and I'll cite them to you, and you can see the reiteration of how he was born into this world, that he's born from the stem of Jesse, that he's born, as a son of man. He calls himself the Son of Man. And we have, obviously, Matthew 1, about the whole lineage of Jesus going through all these people, including Ruth and Boaz. So if you want to see the fulfillment in Messiah, you can look at Galatians 4:4, Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 through 17. You can look at John chapter 1, verse 1, and John chapter 1, verse 14. You can also look at Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. And all of these are references to the nature of Messiah, that indeed he fulfills this qualification of being a relative. In other words, do you understand? God could have not stood above in the atmosphere and dealt with man's sin. Okay? He had to have a way to do it to fulfill the reality of being a kinsman to those being redeemed. That's why Christ had to be born in a human body. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been our kinsman. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, the second thing, the second qualification about the kinsman redeemer that must be met is that the kinsman must possess the necessary resources. And we know that Boaz does. He's a wealthy man. Also, Christ, it said, possesses these resources. And I'm going to give you some citations you can write down if you want them.
Does it include only material resources or also more?
Many resources. But
Boaz, other than wealthy man, he was also a good character man.
Yes, absolutely. But it's, here's some verses to show that Jesus possessed the necessary resources. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 20. Galatians chapter 3, verse 13. 1 Peter 1, verse 18. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 25. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 10 through 14. John chapter 10, verses 15 through 18. 1 John chapter 3, verse 16. John 18:37. Romans 5:8. Isaiah 53:4 and 5 and 6 and 7. All of those verses show that I'm sorry, I went into a few more of them than I should have. I guess we need to stop at Hebrews chapter 10, verses 10 through 14, about possessing the necessary resources. I read on a little bit too much. The third category is willing to pay the purchase price. The kinsman redeemer, if he was going to redeem property or redeem a relative, He had to pay a price, and you're going to see what that is as the chapters unfold. The price he paid is when I started to talk to you about John 10, verses 15 through 18, and 1 John and John 18. Those document that he paid the price. The fourth characteristic of the kinsman redeemer is that he has to be willing to take a bride. Okay? Well, we can clearly see as we read in Boaz's case, it's clear. He takes Ruth eventually. We'll see that as the story unfolds. But Jesus also must take a bride. That bride being, of course, his church. We see this in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 2. We see it in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 25 through 32. And we see it finally in Revelation chapter 19, verse 7. These are all the documentations of Jesus fulfilling these four qualifications as the kinsman redeemer. Okay, now, Naomi tells Ruth to, quote, stick to the workers. Again, we've mentioned this word several times. It's the word dabak in Hebrew. She's supposed to cling or be glued to the harvesters. The harvest that occurred was first the barley harvest, and then secondly the wheat harvest. It was over an approximately 3-month period of time from approximately April through June. So, Naomi, of course, says stick to it until the harvest is all done. Naomi urges Ruth, as does Boaz, to also, again, stick to the workers for her protection, lest someone fall upon her. Do you see that phrase, fall upon her? It's the word pagha, okay, in Hebrew, and it means literally to meet. But its context tells you to meet for what? Well, the context often is to meet in a physical way or to meet to have physical contact. And it usually conveys the concept of meeting someone to do physical violence to them. Okay? Meeting them to kill them, meeting them to hurt them, meeting them to kidnap them. It's used 46 times in the Old Testament this way. So it's commonly used to mean this. So she's to be wary of this. Now, she's also, again, told to stay close and to adhere. And this is reiterated in these 6 verses or so that we are covering. This is reiterated 4 different times. In other words, it becomes a theme of God's love, of His grace, and His protection. Turn, if you would, if you're still in Psalms, turn over to your right and turn to Proverbs. And I want you to go in Proverbs to the 18th chapter. Proverbs 18. And we're going to read verse 24. It says, a man of many friends comes to ruin. Why do you suppose he says that? Why would a man of many friends come to ruin?
They kept everything from him.
Possibly. In other words, they can be not only of no help, but they can also worsen the situation.
Bad influence?
It could be, or it simply means that they act in a way that's not for his benefit, and even though they're supposedly his friends, they become his tormentors. That's what Job complained about all through the book of Job, isn't it? But notice what it says then. A man of many friends comes to ruin, but there is you almost want to put quotes, friend who sticks, here's the word, dabak, closer than a brother. He's referring, of course, to the Lord. He's the one that will always stick close. He's the one that we're supposed to adhere to. He's the one that makes promises to provide for us. Now notice in this 3-month period, that she gleaned, as we said, both barley and also wheat. So she went to both these fields, first the barley fields when they were ready for harvest, and then the wheat fields when they were ready for harvest. I think it's interesting. I was looking up something about Jewish tradition in relation to harvesting, in relationship to the idea of a kinsman redeemer, to being married, things like that. And there's a thing that's said by the Jews. It's a tradition, and that is that a woman must wait 3 months to marry if she's a proselyte to Judaism. Okay? Think about it. How long does Ruth harvest in Boaz's fields? 3 months. Okay? All these things are connections. You know, it's interesting what's put in here. Now, I wanted to show you, for fun, some numbers. And you can play with them yourself, too. Now, it says that she gleaned an ephah each day. In other words, an ephah, because of an ephah will satisfy 2 people for 7 to 10 days. So in other words, each day she has an ephah that she collects of grain. It's 5 times what 2 people are needed to eat per day. Okay? Now, in 1 week, she will have accumulated, because of 6 work days in the week, she'll have accumulated approximately 30 times more than is needed for 2 people to eat. In 1 month, therefore, at this rate, she would have accumulated 120 times more than 2 people needed to eat. And in 3 months, she would have collected 360 times what was needed for 2 people to eat. Therefore, by the Lord's abundant grace, in 3 months, she's collected nearly 1 year of extra food.
How do they save it?
Well, grain lasts for a long time, actually. You know, it's interesting once you take the outside of it off. If it's in a dry place, and certainly we know that they lived in a very dry place, it can last for a very long period of time. Okay? Now, to finish this, I want you to turn to Luke chapter 6. I find this verse a very interesting verse. And I think it's a very descriptive verse for what we see going on here in this story. And it's verse 38. He starts in 36, interestingly, by saying, "Be merciful just as your Father is merciful." And then, of course, commands them not to judge. But in verse 38, he says this, "Give and it will be given to you. Good measure," that means a lot, "pressed down." You can imagine if you have grain, if you shake it, the kernels will start to come together. It'll be pressed down, so there aren't air pockets in there. "Running over," that means superabundance, "they will pour into your lap." Now, here's the key to the verse. It's the last sentence. "For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return." Do you want to have enough? Then give enough. Do you want to be blessed? Then actively seek how to be a blessing. Do you want to make certain that you'll have what you need for the future? Then today, be a blessing and minister to other people in the name of the Lord and show His type of love to them. That is the position that you can put yourself in to know that you also will be blessed. So there's no way to receive a blessing and not respond to that blessing and think that somehow you will have enough and you're just trying to accumulate it. Mm-hmm. It's almost like manna in the wilderness. You can't accumulate it. You can use it and you can pass it on. But God will not honor accumulating in this way. Okay? And of course, there's many, many verses. I didn't want to take the time to do that, especially in the epistles, that talk about the importance of giving. It's very important. And it's a spiritual principle that we should never forget. So, that is the end of chapter 2. And of course, we will start in chapter 3 and we'll see how this drama unfolds in the book of Ruth. Because, of course, now we see that Naomi has an idea of what needs to be done. She's remembering about the principle of the kinsman redeemer. And we're going to see how she's directing Ruth to be a recipient of the kinsman redeemer. So, why don't we close in a word of prayer? And Mike Clapham, would you close us, please?
Sure. Father, we thank you for your word, and we thank you that it reminds us of your character. You are the God who gives. You gave your only unique, one-of-a-kind Son to die for us so that we might live forever.
Sure.
Father, I pray that we would take to heart what Tim shared tonight, and that we would seek to be givers rather than takers. That we would trust you to be generous with our gifts, and that we would have our eyes open for people who are in genuine need. Father, we want to pray for folks who are hurting tonight.
Yes, Lord.
Because of our culture and because of the world in which we live and because of this crisis that we find ourselves. We pray for folks who've lost their jobs,
Mm-hmm.
who don't have stream of income,
Yes.
who don't know where their next meal's coming from. And it happened literally overnight. Father, I pray that you would work in these folks' hearts,
Mm-hmm.
and that if they don't yet know you, you would bring somebody who does know you into their lives,
Yes.
that they might hear the truth
Yes.
and believe in the good news of Jesus.
Amen.
Father, thank you so much for the story of Ruth,
Mm-hmm.
and for what it teaches us about your Son. And help us follow him as we trust you for your provision
Mm-hmm.
in our lives. And we ask this all in Jesus' name.
Amen.